So let's see what we're talking about today. We're talking about dynamic routes, dynamic catch-all routes, and dynamic optional catch-all routes in Next.js. And we're going to learn about them through the docs, the concepts, and also by creating this application here where I have a users table, and all of which is just rendered from one page or one dynamic catch-all segment, where we can click on different users. Each user has a list of to-dos, so we're fetching the to-dos. And if we click on the to-dos, we also see the details. Now, if you look at the URL structure up there, we have the /users, so that's when we land in /users. If we go to a specific user, we would have users /1. This shows us a specific user and a list of to-dos. And if I click on a specific to-do, we even go deeper by having /todos /1, which is the ID of that specific to-do, where we would just see these details here. So let's go to the documentation, start from scratch, and then we're going to jump into the code and build that application or this example together. So dynamic routes are useful when you don't know the exact segment names ahead of time and want to create routes from dynamic data. So you can have blog posts that are sitting inside your CMS or inside a different Git repository. And instead of having static routes for every blog post or every slug, you want to create a dynamic page that receives this slug, receives this ID, whether it's a blog post or a product, and then fetches that specific blog post and renders them all. So instead of creating 100 different pages, you create one dynamic page that can receive that ID and render different products or different blog posts. Now, the convention is to wrap the folder's name in square brackets. You probably know this already. So for example, square bracket ID or square bracket slug. And this is going to be the name of that specific property in the params object we're going to see in this example here. Now, dynamic segments are passed as params to layout, pages, routes, and generate metadata function. So this object is passed by Next.js to your component functions so that you can have access to this dynamic segment to actually fetch the corresponding data. So as an example here, we have the blog and then slug and a page.js, which is responsible for rendering that dynamic page, where the slug is a dynamic segment of the blog post. So our page component receives this params object as a prop, and inside of it has this slug property. It's because we named it slug. If we name it ID, it would be ID. And then here, we would just fetch the necessary data from our database and then render it here. In this example, they're just showing the slug. So with this structure, you can have examples like /blog /a, b, and c. They're all going to be captured with the same dynamic segment. And the params object would look like this with a slug property and then the actual value as a string. Now, before we talk about dynamic catch-all routes, let's talk about generateStaticParams, this function that you can export from your pages. Now, because these dynamic segments are dynamic, meaning that they're not known ahead of time, if you don't export this generateStaticParams function, these pages are going to be rendered dynamically. And by render dynamically, I mean on demand at request time. Because we don't have the specific values at build time, we're going to have to look at the URL at request time on demand and generate these pages. If we want to generate these pages statically, there should be a way for us to tell Next.js all the possible segments that our application has. So therefore, Next.js can generate them statically ahead of time at build time and then serve them up when a request comes in. If you're coming from the pages router or Next.js 12, there was a function called getStaticPaths that you had to export together with getStaticProps, which would instruct Next.js for what segments or paths specifically generate these pages statically. And that has been replaced with this function called generateStaticParams in the app router. And there is a subtle difference between the two functions or the way that they work that I'm going to explain. But basically, you would export this generateStaticParams from your page, the same place where you were accessing this dynamic data to render your pages. And then here you have to return an array of objects, and each object is going to have a property named the same as whatever you named this dynamic segment. So in this case, slug. And then the slug is going to contain the possible values for this slug or the segments. So for example, here we're getting all of the posts inside of our application. We're mapping over all the posts, and for each one, we're just rendering an object or returning an object that sets the slug to post.slug. And with this function, now NextJS knows all the possible segments or values for these dynamic segments ahead of the time. So at build time, it's going to go ahead and generate all these pages statically and serve them up quickly rather than rendering them or generating them on demand at request time. Now there's two differences between the way that this works and the get static paths inside the pages router. The first one is, well, this just returns the slug, whereas in the pages router or inside the get static paths, you had to export an object that has a params property, and then the params property was an object, and inside that object you had a slug. So it's just simpler. And the second difference, which is more important, is inside the dynamic segments in the pages router, the way that we used to do NextJS, you had to export the generate static paths. Otherwise, your application would error out. But here, this generate static params is optional. So it's for optimization. If you want these pages to be rendered statically at build time, you can export it. But if you eliminate it, the function component for the page is going to run anyways on demand at request time, and the page is going to be created. The difference is that here is going to be rendered dynamically at request time, but if you export this function, it will be generated statically. So you don't have to, it's optional. If you want to optimize for static pages, you can. So have that in mind. We're going to use that also inside our application, and it becomes a little bit more trickier when your slug is actually catch all, which we're going to learn about now, which is not a simple string. It is actually an array of strings. So let's look at the catch all segment. Now, dynamic segments can be extended to catch all subsequent segments by adding an ellipsis inside the bracket. So you can add these three dots, and this is going to capture everything that comes after. So all the subsequent segments as well. For example, if we have the shop and then slug as a dynamic segment, it will match /shop /clothes, but it also matches /clothes /tops, or even another segment. So it catches all of them, hence the name catch all segment. So for example, this same path that we have here can have these example URLs, shop A, shop /AB, and ABC. But the slug in these cases, when you're dealing with catch all routes, is going to be an array of strings. It won't be a string like the example before. It will be an array of strings. So we're going to also see this in action in the code. And the last one is optional catch all, where you have the but instead of one square bracket, you actually wrap it with the folder name with 2 square brackets. Okay. So for example, this one is going to match /shop, and optional means, or the only difference is between the catch-all and the optional catch-all is that the optional catch-all also matches when there is no segment subsequent to the first one. So it matches /shop and /shop /clothes and anything that comes after. Whereas here, this one, which is coming after shop, there has to be something. So it is /A, AB, AB, and C. So it catches the subsequent ones, but the optional one says, hey, this dynamic segment, it's catch-all, but it's also optional. So also render this same page for /shop. And this is what we're going to use inside our application. And in this case, as an example, your page is going to match /shop, or /A, AB, and ABC. And in this case, your params object would be an empty object if there is no slug passed. Because it's optional, you won't have any slug present. And if you do, it's going to be an array of strings because you're still inside of this ... or catch all type of route. Down here, we see the TypeScript types that you can pass in depending on your structure. So if your structure is like so, your slug is a string. If you're using a catch-all route, your slug is going to be an array of string. If it is optional, well, you add an optional. And if you have two segments, one after the other, you just have to set that type depending on your specific structure. There's not one size fits all formula here. It's just you have to see what is your route or folder structure. Now with this out of the way, let's jump into the code and actually put all of this in action. So I've started from a brand new application that I've actually cloned from this repo. It's called NextJs. It's a starter template that uses NextJS, TypeScript, Tell Me CSS, and shadcn built in. You can click this, use this template, create a new repository out of this, and then clone it in your local machine and start working with it. What it gives you is this header up top. It comes with the theming like light and dark themes, and then a simple footer. Some plugins for Tailwind to sort your utility classes in a nice way. So we have this NextJs starter. So if you go to the repositories here, you can see this NextJs, which is also a template for TypeScript NextJS, but this shadcn one actually comes with shadcn. So if you are into using shadcn, you can use this to start from the same starting point that I have. So let's look at our app structure inside the layout. Let me close this off from a high level. As I mentioned, I have the theme provider. This is from the Next Themes package to enable us to have the light and dark theme. I have a simple header and a simple footer. Inside the header, what I'm doing is rendering the home and the link for the users page, and a theme toggle. That is this button here that allows us to toggle the theme. It's pretty straightforward. So let's go close this off and go to our page component. This is our home page. So on the home page, if you're not saying anything, it's just dynamic routes. And then the fun begins where we wanted to actually go to /user. So when we click here on /users, we're actually going inside of this folder. Let me just make this a bit bigger. So inside of users, I have this dynamic optional catch all route for slug. Inside of it, there is a page, and also there is a layout. So let's go to the layout and see what we're doing inside the layout, and then we would dive into the page. So inside of the layout, I have the users layout. So this is the page that we're seeing here. You can accomplish this in different ways. This is one way of implementing this optional catch-all route, where we have the same layout and the same page rendering the users, the specific user page, and also the to-dos page. And I thought it's a good opportunity to also see these structures together, or actually use a layout here. But you can also implement this in different ways. So in the user's layout, we receive the params. This is the params object that NextJS sends to us. Layout would receive a children. These are the pages or nested layouts that can be plugged in here. And what we're doing here is rendering this kind of structure down here, where we are mapping over our users. For each one, we're showing this links on the right hand side. And then underneath, I'm just plugging this children. But because this is a flex, it just whatever children we pass as a page here, it will be shown to the right hand side where my mouse is right now. So inside of this layout, I'm actually calling this get users function to fetch all of my users, to then map and create this table here. Now let's dive into get users real quick. So I've created this lib folder where I have different types for my to-dos, for my users. And I have this utils. This comes from shadcn for merging Tailwind classes. And then I have this users where I have defined some functions that allows me to talk to my database. In this case, I'm using mock API. I've shown this before. So it allows you to have mock APIs and call your endpoints to get some resources, in this case, users and to-dos. Once you create an account, it gives you an endpoint. You can create resources and then shape the schema for each of these resources and then hit the endpoints. But this is the same place that you can talk to your database, fetch whatever data that you want from your CMS, from your Shopify, whatever that may be. So I'm getting the users in this instance, and I'm returning an object with the users or error if an error happens. So inside the layout, I'm getting all the users, and I'm mapping to create this shell over here. So let's close this off, go back to our page now. So inside of my page, this is the actual page inside of the dynamic slug or dynamic catch-all route. I'm still receiving the params. Again, I'm getting the slug out. If I don't have any slug, it means because I'm optional catch-all route, this also matches /users. And that's what's happening here. So I'm hitting the /users, and this page still catches this because it's optional, because I have double square brackets. And I'm saying if there is no slug, well, we are on the all users page, so just render this users component, which just says select a user to see the list of to-dos. This is this thing rendering here. And again, this page, this component is rendered inside this page, and this page is plugged into our layout because it's passed to it as the children, and it's plugged in here, rendered in a display flex, so it just shows up on this side. Going back inside of our page, if I do have a slug, this means that I am on a specific user page. So I have another component, it's called user. Let's just dive into that, and I'm passing the slug to it, and this is responsible for rendering a specific user. So what am I doing here? Well, first I'm receiving this slug that was passed to me, and then I'm getting the first segment of my slug. That's the user ID. So if I click on this specific guy, it's users, and then / so the first segment of my slug, which is at index 0, is going to be the user ID. This is that specific user. Now the next slug is going to be the string to-dos. So if I click on one of these to-dos, you can see I have users, the user ID, then I have the string to-dos, and then the to-do ID. So that's why I'm skipping here. The first segment was the user ID, the second segment is going to be the string to-do, and the third segment here is going to be the to-do ID. So what are we doing with this data? Well, I'm getting the user ID, and I'm passing it to this get user by ID function to get the user. So let's dive into this real quick. It just hits the same endpoint in our mock API, and then we pass in an ID to our user's endpoint to get that specific user. So we get the specific user. If there is no user, or if there's any error, I'm calling the not found function. This is going to just show the not found page, or your 404 page if you don't have a not found page. Next, I am also passing this user ID to get to-dos by user ID. That's another function that's going to hit the user's ID and then to-dos. This is going to give me all the to-dos for this specific user. So I'm getting all the to-dos. Sure, that's the to-dos. I'm also trying to see if they are on a specific to-do detail page by finding the to-dos, by mapping over this to-dos, and then finding the one that matches the to-do ID, this to-do ID that we got out of the slug. Now, it may seem a bit confusing, but if I go on the user and do not click on any of these to-dos, well, I have the user and then the user ID. So this user ID is there, but there is no other segment. So there is no to-do ID. So I understand that I'm not on a specific to-do page. So this to-do would return undefined because this to-do ID doesn't exist. But I have the user. So I show the user, I still fetch the user, and down here what I'm doing is show the user data, their image, their email, and I'm mapping over the to-dos that I fetched down here by passing that same user ID. I'm mapping over the to-dos. For each one, I'm showing a link that if they click on, they can see a detail. But if they click on it, they would go to user ID, to-dos, and that to-do ID. Once they click on any of these to-dos by going to that route, they're going to end up on this same component again because this is a catch-all route. It catches all the subsequent segments. So it is get caught in here again, but this time around, this to-do ID would have a value because now we have set it, this to-do ID to this segment. So therefore, when we're mapping over the to-dos to find this specific ID or the one that matches here, this to-do would actually be an object. And down here, I'm saying if there is a to-do, or if we are on a to-do specific page, or if that segment actually exists, well then show the detail of that. And that happens when I click on it, I go to /todos/1, that ID is now present in the URL, it gets captured by the same page, I find a specific to-do and render the details down here. I can click on different ones to show different details, or click on a different user to see different to-dos, and then click on different to-dos. Now, to show the active to-do, just like how I'm underlining here, inside of this link, inside of the class, I'm just looking to see when I'm mapping over my to-dos, if the to-do ID is the same as the to-do ID that I got out of my slug here, this means I'm on that current to-do. So that's the active to-do. And if it is the active to-do, I'm just showing this underline decoration sky that shows this blue underline. I'm also doing something similar in this users list. So if we go back to the layout where we are rendering this shell of our users, inside of this links, when I'm mapping over each user, if the user ID is equal to the user ID that it is present in the slug or in the segments of our URL, that means that specific user is active. So therefore, I'm showing this underlines. This is responding to whatever ID is up there. So it just reads that, compares this with this ID, and draws a line similar to here. Now, we could have had this layout also inside of the users folder. So right now, the layout is inside this dynamic catch-all route. It could have been inside the user, but the only difference would be that if the layout was inside of the users, which is one level higher than our dynamic segment, we wouldn't have gotten this params object inside of our layout. So I moved it inside the dynamic catch-all route specifically to just render the active user so that I get the specific params. Because if this was outside, we could still fetch all of the users. This is still not specific to any user, so we could get all of the users, render the shell. I only moved it inside, so I have access to this params object because now this layout is inside of the dynamic catch-all route, which then allows me to get the user ID, the specific ID that's present in the URL, and compare it to the list of my users and actually know which of my users is active. And that's all there is to it, to render all of these pages and different sections or segments with this one page and one layout. Now, before we wrap up, I want to talk about the generateStaticParams function. Now, to show you what I mean, inside of our page, we are not exporting the generateStaticParams. So right now, all of our dynamic segments are going to be rendered dynamically, which means on demand at request time. Now, to show this in action, let's actually stop the dev server and build our application. So if you look closely for this users and then our dynamic catch-all route, you see this lambda sign, which down here, it just tells you that it is dynamic. It's server rendered on demand using Node.js because we haven't specified any runtime. It just runs or it's deployed as serverless functions. But our point is that it is going to be on demand. It's dynamic. It's not static. Okay. So let's contrast this with actually exporting a generateStaticParams function from this file. So let's bring in our generateStaticParams. I'm going to explain what we're doing here. So we're getting all of our users. That's the same function we've seen before. If we don't have any users, we just return an empty array. This is saying, hey, don't generate anything statically, generate everything on demand. Now, for each user that I have inside of my users that I got back, if they exist, I'm going to map over them. And for each one, I'm going to fetch the to-dos for that specific user. And if the user doesn't have any to-dos, the only thing I push to my slugs array is an array that contains the user ID. That's the first segment inside of our URL, which is this /7 or whatever comes as the first segment after the /users. And if I do have some to-dos for this specific user, for each one, I'm pushing this array to my slugs, which contains the user ID and then the to-dos string and then the to-do specific ID. So therefore, for each to-do, I'm returning one specific array. So if a user has multiple to-dos, there's going to be multiple of these arrays where I have the user ID the same, the to-dos is string, and then the to-do ID changes. And if a user doesn't have any to-do, the only thing that we're pushing is the user ID. Now, these are still arrays. We have to turn them into an object that has a slug property that's set to this array. So at the end, for generating all the paths or all the segments that I want NextJS to generate statically at build time, I'm going to map over my slugs array that I pushed different sorts of arrays and slugs to. And for each slug, I'm going to return an object that has a slug property set to that specific array that was pushed to my slugs array. And I'm returning these paths. And with this, now NextJS knows what segments it can generate statically at build time. So let's save this up and open up our dev terminal again and run the pm build again. Here we go. And if we look at our dynamic catch all route here, it's no longer marked with the lambda, which was representing dynamic on-demand rendering. Instead, it's this field dot, which is SSG or static site generation, which is a static HTML. And if you look closely here, it also gives you the examples or some of the paths that was generated. So /users, /1 to dos and 1. And down here, it also says plus 37 more paths. So it mapped over every user, and for each one fetched the to-dos. If it had, it generated the arrays of different segments to pass into our slugs. So when a request comes in for any of these pages, instead of generating this page on demand, it just serves up the static version that was generated at build time. And that's a wrap for this video, folks. We talked about dynamic routes and dynamic segments in NextJS. We talked about the convention of wrapping the folder name with the square brackets. We also talked about catch-all routes and also optional catch-all routes that is going to allow you to match any subsequent segments inside the URL as well. And the difference between the catch-all and optional was that the optional also matches the index when you don't have any dynamic segments, whereas the catch-all at least needed one dynamic segment. We also talked about the generateStaticParams function that is going to instruct NextJS to build some of these dynamic paths or dynamic segments statically at build time versus rendering them dynamically on demand. We also talked about the difference between generateStaticParams in the app router and the generate or get static paths inside the pages router, where we had it before and it was required. But here it's optional. It's more an optimization technique. If you don't export this function, you can still have dynamic segments and dynamic pages, but all of them are going to be rendered dynamically on demand at request time. And if you do export the generateStaticParams and give NextJS specific paths to generate, you don't have to generate all the possible paths. In this case, we did get all the users and all the to-dos, but if you have a humongous database of users, maybe you don't want to create this for all the users, or blog posts for that matter. Maybe you just want to statically generate your popular blog posts based on their previous views or previous engagements. So you don't have to return all the possible paths. Whatever you want to return or whatever you return from this function is going to be statically generated at build time, and the rest are still going to be rendered, but dynamically on demand. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments like always, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.